So a couple of origin stories about Mother's Day. I'll give the Unitarian connection one a little later, but the first one, Anne Reeves Gervais was a woman in the mid-1800s who started a Mother's Day working party. Mothers would get together and work together for a day on education for other mothers to make sure their children could minimize infections, sanitation. They were really teaching kind of health practices. And then when the Civil War started, they started taking care of soldiers for their working parties, these mothers. And then when the Civil War ended, they started holding reconciliation events for mothers and their children who had fought on both sides of the American Civil War. A few decades later, her daughter, also Anne Gervais, she wanted to honor her mother by getting this to be a recognized holiday. And so she petitioned and she made it happen. And within about a decade, the commercialization of Mother's Day had started to occur. And Anne Gervais could not stand it. And she particularly didn't like the greeting cards that were pre-printed that people could buy and send to their mothers. She said, "How could you more dishonor your mother than not even take the time to write your own greeting card to her, to buy a printed greeting card and send it to her instead?" And she ended up organizing protests against Mother's Day. Founded and protest Mother's Day all in one lifetime. And isn't that why we come to church? To this church, so we can start things and protest them. But really so that we can follow that thread. Follow that thread of a desire to spend our efforts to honor our mothers and all of our humanity by working for a more peaceful, more just world. So that's what we're here celebrating this morning. Will you rise, embody our spirit, and we'll sing together, "This Is My Song."
Well, happy Mother's Day to all the mothers and to all people who nurture, because lots of people fill roles of mothering besides people who are female. So I want to honor that today. And in this church, Mother's Day has for many, many years been a celebration of that spirit and the desire for peace in the world. In 1985, when I was still a Green Director of Religious Education, I got a newsletter. And there was a Dr. Jack Mayer in Vermont. He was a physician, and he was really worried about children in the world and the kind of message that they were receiving about how dangerous the threat of nuclear war was. And I would love to not be standing here and saying that isn't the case, but we still have to be concerned, and we still have to reassure our children. He designed a ceremony and a treaty, which I implore you to sign so I can send it to Ottawa yet again, as I do every year. But his idea was that children and adults' voices together and the pealing of bells would happen in every time zone around the world. And I know that there are still a few Unitarian churches doing that. I don't know how many, but it doesn't matter. We still need to care about this issue. So my child who was going to do the reading has fallen through, but I'm going to ask Catherine Nicholson to do the responsive reading for us. And I don't know, is it going to be up there? No. Okay.
I invite you to join me in the responsive reading of the Peace Bell Treaty, which is in your order of service. And I encourage you to repeat each line after me. As citizens of the lovely planet Earth, we gather to declare ourselves at peace. With all other peoples. Therefore, we call upon the governments of the world to make peace with mutual security. We call for the elimination of nuclear weapons. We are a wondrous species. endlessly creative and capable of great love. With the ringing of this bell, I affix my signature to the Peace Bell Treaty. Where's the bell?
And I goof because we should.
We were supposed to get the bells first.
With the ringing of this bell, we celebrate the peace bell treaty.
So I've got a story too today for anybody who would like to come forward for a story. Anyone young or young at heart just wants to be up close with the action. Hey, Harper. This is a story about a beach. Have any of you ever been to a beach? Yeah, good, excellent. Me too. Would anybody like to be at a beach right now? It's a glorious day for it. So, this is a very special beach, though, and at this beach, at the top of this beach, up on the hill overlooking the beach, there was an old house. And in this old house, that was kind of a crooked old house with a crooked porch and a crooked chair, crooked rocking chair on the porch, there was a kind of a crooked old man who lived in this house. And he would rock back and forth on his crooked rocking chair all day, every day, except he would have it facing away from the beach. He'd be facing, so he was looking right back at his house instead of out over this beautiful beach. He was a very sad man, and there's a whole story there, but that's not what the story is about. The story is about one day when he looked out and he saw out of the corner of his eye a little red dot. Traveling all along the bluff, all along the cliff atop the beach. And he saw that little red dot make its way down to the beach, and as it came closer and closer to his house, he saw it was actually a little girl who was dressed all in red. And she was skipping merrily along, having a great time on a beautiful day like today at the beach. And she was amazed because when she got to the beach, she saw that it was a beach like none other she had ever seen. It was a beach with sparkling red and purple and blue and yellow and dazzling sand of every color. And she couldn't believe her eyes. Why had no one ever told her about this beach? She didn't live that far away. She couldn't believe it. She got down to the beach and she was marveling at it. She picked up the sand and she let it run through her fingers. She did that a couple times and then she realized, this isn't normal sand. Something a little off. And she started looking around and she noticed there were a lot of starfish lying out on this beach. But they didn't look so good. They looked like they were kind of stuck and drying out. And then she put her hands once more in the sand and she realized it wasn't sand at all. It was starfish. It was dried up starfish who had died there on the beach. And she was horrified. She was so sad to see all these starfish there dying on the beach. And she thought, I have to do something about this. And so she started picking them up. And she'd pick up a starfish and she'd throw it out back into the ocean. And she'd run, pick up another starfish and she'd throw it back into the ocean. And she would run back and forth across the beach, picking up all these starfish, throwing them back. But she realized she was only throwing one or two back at a time, and more were washing up. More were washing up than she could possibly throw back. So she redoubled her efforts, and she'd scoop up big handfuls at a time and toss them back in, and then she was using her feet too, and she was kicking them and throwing them and getting back as many as fast as she could, but still, the ocean was turning more starfish up on the beach faster than she could send them back. And when she realized that and she was exhausted from all her efforts, she sat down on the beach and she started crying. And at that moment, the old man who had been watching the girl the whole time, he came down onto the beach. And he put a hand on her shoulder. And he said, "Well, I'm sorry you had to learn the lesson this way, little girl. But now you've learned what I had to learn long ago, what we all have to learn. You can't make a difference. Nothing you do really matters. Things are going to be bad for a long time yet. And the little girl heard this, and she thought, oh my God, that's true, I can't do anything. And she was crying about it and feeling it, and then she noticed down by her toe the most beautiful starfish you've ever seen. This starfish had a center that was golden, and it was almost like glowing. It was so golden. And then the arms started to stretch out in royal purple. And then at the tips, they came out into a flaming red. Gold and purple and red, those are just my favorite colors. You can imagine other colors if you think that would be more beautiful. She saw the most beautiful starfish right by her toe. And she reached out and picked up that starfish. It kind of snapped her out of that spell, out of that crying, and she held that beautiful starfish, and she thought to herself, not this one, and she took a running step back, and she ran forward, and she threw that starfish as far as she could. And she and the old man, they watched that starfish sail out over the nearest waves, sail out over the reef under the water that was the reason why this particular beach was the starfish beach, sail out all the way to the horizon. I don't know how she did it, but she loved that starfish so much that it made it way back into the ocean. It never washed up on shore again. And she turned to the old man and she said, it's not true. For that starfish, I made a difference. For that starfish, I made a difference. And there's some more to the story, but I want to end it with that for now, that there is the possibility of making a difference, and I hope each of you will. I guess that many of you would know the second origin story of Mother's Day, but it's a story that bears repeating. The Unitarian Julia Ward Howe, who perhaps is ironically best known for writing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, was a celebrated poet and dedicated peace activist in the second half of the 19th century. She traveled in influential circles and worked tirelessly for women's suffrage, for the abolition of slavery, for prison and education reform. She became a pacifist after the American Civil War during the Franco-Prussian War. Her niece once described her in her elder years like this: Aunt Julia was a small woman of no particular shape or carriage, clothes never quite taken care of, her bonnets never quite straight on her head, and yet there was a presence about her, an unforgettable distinction and importance. Her speaking voice was beautiful, and her face had a sensitive gravity, a look of compassionate wisdom, until a twinkle of fun rippled over it and a naughty imp laughed in her eyes. In 1870, she proclaimed the first Mother's Day for peace. And this is the proclamation. If you've heard it before, forgive me, but it bears repeating. Again, she said, again, in the sight of the Christian world, have the skill and power of two great nations exhausted themselves in mutual murder. Again, have the sacred questions of international justice been committed to the fatal mediation of military weapons. In this day of progress, in this century of light, the ambition of rulers has been allowed to barter the dear interests of domestic life for the bloody exchanges of the battlefield. Thus men have done, thus men will do, but women need no longer be made a party to the proceedings which fill the globe with grief and horror. Despite the assumptions of physical force, the mother has a sacred and commanding word to say to the sons who owe their life to her suffering. That word should now be heard and answered to as never before. Arise then, she said, Christian women of this day, arise all women who have hearts, whether your baptism be that of water or of tears. Say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We, women of one country, will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm, disarm. The sword of murder is not the balance of justice. Blood does not wipe out dishonor, nor violence vindicate possession. As men have often forsaken the plow and anvil at the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left of home for a great and earnest day of council. This was her call. Let them meet first as women to bewail and commemorate the dead. Let them then solemnly take counsel with each other as to the means whereby the great human family can live in peace. Man as the brother of man, each bearing after his own kind the sacred impress not of Caesar but of God. In the name of womanhood and of humanity, I earnestly ask that a general congress of women, without limit of nationality, may be appointed and held at some place deemed most convenient, and at the earliest period consistent with its objects to promote the alliance of the different nationalities, the amicable settlement of international questions, the great and general interests of peace. This General Congress of Women, it didn't coalesce. Although she did manage to convene the first convention of women ministers, which continued for many years. The great and general interests of peace. Peace, the sixth principle of our covenant with all other Unitarian Universalist congregations, declares that we affirm and promote the goal of world community with peace, justice, and liberty for all. Luckily, this goal is not unique to our tradition, and what better occasion to celebrate our common humanity, our longing for peace, than this day where our culture honors the sacred role of motherhood. So last year, Emily shared this story on Mother's Day, her first Mother's Day preaching as a mother. She said a few weeks ago, I went with my toddler son to Strong Start, free drop-in community program for children under 5. Little kids from Iran, Japan, Korea, China, Iranian, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Latino families, they played with each other, shared the sandbox and puppets and juice boxes. Parents poured each other coffee and exchanged exhausted smiles. Miss Rosa, the teacher, led us in songs, being sure to include the languages everyone spoke at home. I was struck, Emily said, by the beauty of the moment, how calm and intentional Miss Rosa was. She said, I started to cry when we sang Annyeong Chingu, hello friend, in Korean. I thought of the little children in Korea who sing in classrooms with books and blocks and teddy bears just like this one, whose parents wipe their snotty noses and fold their clothes and watch them sleep at night. I thought, I do not want to be at war with those children, with those parents. I do not want any of us staying up late worrying about nuclear weapons or missile range. The world was calling to me with its beauty and its pain. Our common humanity, our common calling to bring healing to a hurting world. I grew up in and will soon return to a country that has often seen itself as a beacon for this vision. The early American colonist John Winthrop quoted Jesus' Sermon on the Mount as he declared to his fellow colonists, "We must always consider that we shall be a city upon the hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." And then, John F. Kennedy famously reused that image, that shining sea upon the hill. And it was central for Ronald Reagan as well. And while my country has never lived up to this image, I think it has nevertheless played a significant role in the moral imagination of people around the world. And I can't say this for sure, but I've heard from some of you who lived through the 60s and 70s that this seems true, that the battle over the vision of the United States of America is more fiercely contested now than it's been in many generations. There are those who are calling the current political landscape a bloodless civil war, others predicting deeper schisms and even maybe a civil war to come. And while I certainly hope they're wrong, I think one thing is clear: the United States looks more like a crumbling McMansion on a terrible fault line than a shining city on the hill. It's certainly possible that we're witnessing the early days of the fall of the American empire. It's not unlikely. Which, of course, brings us to Bono, who in 2002 repurposed the 1995 tourism ad campaign and declared, "The world needs more Canada." So as I've come to appreciate, there's already a lot of Canada. I think I've got the order of the southern provinces along the 49th parallel down, but go north of that, and there's an awful lot of Canada I still have, it's all kind of a jumble for me. But if anyone here is needing more Canada, you really should have been at our office administrator Janny's Canadian citizenship party last week. I don't think you could have packed any more Canada into this building. What a joyful celebration. Janny couldn't have been happier. Couldn't have been happier to be welcomed in, to be granted citizenship, to fully belong and be embraced as a Canadian, to have you celebrate with her. Whether or not the world needs more Canada, it's certainly good to have more Canadians, and especially more like Janny. But here's what I really want to say. What I think the world really needs is for Canada to be more Canada. I think the world really needs Canada to be more Canada. Last year I shared some reflections from Handel Wright. He's a black man on the education faculty at the Center for Cultural Identity and Exploration at UBC. And he spoke at an event that was titled "Examining Whiteness: What's at Stake for Canada?" And so he compared the image text of Canada, what he called the image text of Canada, the story that is told of a beautiful mosaic of diversity, the welcoming and tolerant nation that embraces pluralism, embraces the other, against the historical and present realities of white supremacy. He talked about residential schools that have been so present in the public eye while we've lived here. He talked about racist immigration laws and policies throughout the 20th century. He mentioned what were then very recent, are still fairly recent examples of explicit white supremacist action, the pamphlets distributed right here in Richmond, the shooting at the Quebec Mosque, as well as what he called the soft white supremacy of whiteness of Canadian institutions in their culture and leadership. I really do believe that one of the most challenging obstacles to peace in our world is white supremacy, is the Eurocentric logic of white supremacy the legacy of colonialism. And the danger that I've seen while living here in Canada and overcoming those obstacles is that it's too easy to believe in the image text. It's too easy to think this probably is the best way that things can be. There was a moment from our first month here in Vancouver, we shared it with you then, and it was on my mind again planning for today. We were on the sidewalk putting coins in a parking meter when a minivan pulled into the parking place next to us. The van halted, jerked backward and forward. It's a slow process. Momentarily, it blocked the street. And when the car behind the van could finally pass, the white driver leaned out his window, gave a disgusted look, and he snarled, "Go home, you Chinese retard." The driver avoided eye contact, driver of the van. We noticed his son, less than 10 years old, sitting next to him in the passenger seat, wincing. We were taken aback, stunned at that, out of the blue moment of anger, of racism, startling and familiar. Emily said as she reflected on that moment in a sermon, a reminder that racism exists here and now, even in Canada, even in Vancouver, even now, even today. And whether it's racism at large, or truth, healing, and reconciliation with the indigenous peoples of the land, or further reforming prisons and mental health care. There's a petition sitting out there with the peace treaty that other Unitarian churches in the area are also circulating right now, urging the end of the use of solitary confinement in the treatment of mental health. Whether it's finding a new way to power our industry and transportation without continuing to plunder and wreak havoc on our planet, whether it's facing the opioid epidemic with clear heads and compassionate hearts, advancing the incarnation of a feminist society, ensuring affordable daycare is available to all families, or working on the basic need for housing for all. The world needs Canada to be more Canada. Perhaps especially those of us to your south. We will need you to be that shining city on the hill, demonstrating what a country committed to pluralism can be, demonstrating what peace, order, and good government can provide. The world needs a country to live up to its image text. Because this image text of Canada, this mosaic of diversity, thriving in peace, it's a beautiful vision. You've probably had moments like that one that Emily described from playgroup, where you catch a glimpse of the world as it can and should be, the world as we hope it's becoming. We did an art project once in another congregation. We invited everyone to bring plastic soldiers, other toys of war and violence, and we transformed them eventually into a mosaic of a dove of peace. It echoed another project on the congregation's land where handguns had been collected and molded into a sculpture of a plowshare. It feels trite sometimes to talk about peace. It feels so ephemeral. And we can't all go to work at the UN and draft peace accords. We can't all work on legislation to treat people in state custody more humanely. Those pieces of art, they didn't suddenly change the world. But we don't know all the ripples of our actions. We don't know how those who participated in these simple art projects were changed. We don't know the trajectories of the children who saw them and what they might do one day. Lao Tzu, The great Taoist teacher wrote, "If there is to be peace in the world, there must be peace in the nations. If there is to be peace in the nations, there must be peace in the cities. If there is to be peace in the cities, there must be peace between neighbors. If there is to be peace between neighbors, there must be peace in the home. If there is to be peace in the home, there must be peace in the heart." This work of living the image text of Canada, this work of truth, healing, and reconciliation, of healing old wounds, of becoming who we know we can be. It will not be accomplished in a single generation. Perhaps 7 generations hence it will, and new dreams will emerge. Until then, I think the words that we spoke together, that we anchored our service of installation last March, must be our guide. These words from the Jewish Talmud. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work. But neither are you free to abandon it. There's an alternative ending to that starfish story. In this version, there are witnesses to the exchange between the little girl and the old man. Others from the nearby town standing on the bluff. Witnesses to that moment when she hurls the starfish out past the cove and declares she's made a difference for that one. In this version, the witnesses spread the tale of the little girl who cared enough to do something about the starfish in spite of the terrible odds, in spite of the inexorable forces of time and ocean. In this version, the next day, 12 people show up at that beach, roll up their sleeves, ready to save some starfish. In this version, people take note of this community of care and commitment. People take note of how much fun these people are having, how working together for a common purpose makes the task of stooping and throwing starfish effortless, how it brings joy to their eyes. In this version, the old man is swept up in the irresistible desire to be part of something bigger than himself. He brings tea and biscuits down to those working on the shoreline. In this version, the world is made whole. One starfish, one hand, one heart at a time. May it be so. Amen.